أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ياسين والقرآن الحكيم إنك لمن المرسلين على صراط مستقيم تنزيل العزيز الرحيم لتنذر قوما ما أنذر آباءهم فهم غافلون لقد حق القول على أكثرهم فهم لا يؤمنون إنا جعلنا في أعناقهم أغلالا فهي إلى الأذقان فهم مقمحون وجعلنا من بين أيديهم سدا ومن خلفهم سدا فأغشيناهم فهم لا يبصرون وسواء عليهم أنذرتهم أم لم تنذرهم لا يؤمنون إنما تنذر من اتبع الذكر وخشي الرحمن بالغيب فبشره بمغفرة وأجر كريم. نحن نحيي الموتى ونكتب ما قدموا وآثارهم وكل شيء أحصيناه في إمام مبين. واضرب لهم مثلا أصحاب القرية إذا جاءها المرسلون إذ أرسلنا إليهم اثنين فكذبوهما فعززنا بثالث فقالوا إنا إليكم مرسلون. قالوا ما أنتم إلا بشر مثلنا وما أنزلنا الرحمن من شيء إن أنتم إلا تكذبون. قالوا ربنا يعلم إنا إليكم لمرسلون وما علينا إلا البلاغ المبين. قالوا إنا تطيرنا بكم لئن لم تنتهوا لنرجمنكم وليمسنكم منا عذاب أليم. قالوا طائركم معكم أئن ذكرتم بل أنتم قوم مسرفون. وجاء من أقصى المدينة رجل يسعى قال يا قوم اتبعوا المرسلين اتبعوا من لا يسألكم أجرا وهم مهتدون. وما لا أعبد الذي فطرني وإليه ترجعون. أعتقد من دونه آلهة إن يردني الرحمن بضر لا تغني عني شفاعتهم شيئا ولا ينقذون. إني لفي ضلال مبين. إني آمنت بربكم فاسمعون. قيل ادخل الجنة قال يا ليت قومي يعلمون بما غفر لي ربي وجعلني من المكرمين. وما أنزلنا على قومه من بعده من جند من السماء وما كنا منزلين. إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم خامدون. يا حسرة على العباد ما يأتيهم من رسول إلا كانوا به يستهزئون. ألم يروا كم أهلكنا قبلهم من القرون أنهم إليهم لا يرجعون. وإن كل لما جميع لدينا محضرون. وآية لهم الأرض الميتة أحيينا وأخرجنا منها حبا فمنه يأكلون. وجعلنا فيها جنة من نخيل وعنب وفجرنا فيها من العيون ليأكلوا من ثمره وما عملت أيديهم أفلا يشكرون. سبحان الذي خلق الأزواج كلها مما تنبت الأرض ومن أنفسهم ومما لا يعلمون. وآية لهم الليل نسخ منه النهار فإذا هم مظلمون. والشمس تجري لمستقر لها ذلك تقدير العزيز العليم. والقمر قدرناه منازل حتى عاد كالأرجون القديم. لا الشمس ينبغي لها أن تدرك القمر والليل سابق النهار وكل في فلك يسبحون. وآية لهم أنا حملنا ذريتهم في الفلك المشحون وخلقنا لهم من مثله ما يركبون. وإن 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 نغرقهم فلا صريخ لهم ولهم ينقذون إلا رحمة منا ومتاع إلى حين. وإذا قيل لهم أتقون بين أيديكم وما خلفكم لعلكم ترحمون. وما تأتيهم من آية من آيات ربهم إلا كانوا عنها معرضين. وإذا قيل لهم أنفقوا مما رزقكم رزقكم الله قال الذين كفروا للذين آمنوا من لو يشاء الله أطعمه إن أنتم إلا في ضلال مبين ويقولون متى هذا الوعد إن كنتم صادقين ما ينظرون إلا صيحة واحدة تأخذهم يوم يكسمون فلا يستطيعون توصية ولا إلى أهلهم يرجعون ونفخ في الصور فإذا هم من الأجداث إلى ربهم ينسلون قالوا يا ويلنا من بعثنا من مرقدنا هذا هذا موعد الرحمن وصدق المرسلون إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم جميع لدينا محضرون فاليوم لا تظلم نفس شيئا ولا تجزون إلا ما كنتم تعملون إن أصحاب الجنة اليوم في شغل فاكهون هم وأزواجهم في ظلال على الأرائك متكئون لهم فيها فاكهة ولهم ما يدعون سلام قول من رب رحيم وامتازوا اليوم أيها المجرمون ألم أحد إليكم يا بني آدم تعبدوا الشيطان إنه لكم عدو مبين وأن اعبدوني هذا صراط مستقيم ولقد أزل منكم جبل كثيرا أفلم تكونوا تأكلون هذه جهنم التي كنتم توعدون اصلوها اليوم بما كنتم تكفرون اليوم نختم على أفواههم وتكلمنا أيديهم وتشهد أرجلهم بما كانوا يكسبون ولو نشاء لطمسنا على أعينهم فاستبقوا الصراط فأنى يبصرون ولو نشاء لمسكناهم على مكانتهم فما استطاعوا مزيا ولا يرجعون ومن نؤمره ننكس في الخلق أفلا يعقلون وما علمناه الشعر وما ينبغي له إن هو إلا ذكر وقرآن مبين لينذر من كان حيا ويهك القول والكافرين أولم يروا أنا خلقنا لهم مما عملت أيدينا أنعاما فهم لها مالكون وذللناها لهم فمنها ركوبهم ومما يأكلون ولهم فيها منافع ومشارب أفلا يشكرون واتخذوا من دون الله آلهة لعلهم ينصرون لا يستطيعون نصرهم وهم جند محضرون فلا يحزنك قولهم إنا نعلم ما يسرون وما يعلنون أولم ير الإنسان أنا خلقناه من نطفة فإذا هو خصيم مبين وضرب لنا مثلا ونسي خلقه قال من يحيي العظام وهي رميم قل يحييها الذي أشاء أول مرة وهو بكل خلق عليم الذي جعل لكم من شاجر أخضر نارا فإذا هم أنتم منه توقدون أوليس الذي خلق السماوات والأرض بقادر على أن يخلق مثلهم بلى وهو الخلاق العليم إنما أمره إذا أراد شيئا أن يقول له كن فيكون فسبحان الذي بيده ملكوت كل شيء وإليه ترجعون. صلوات. سورة الفاتحة.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم إني أسألك برحمتك التي وسعت كل شيء وبقوتك التي قهرت بها كل شيء وخضع لها كل شيء وظل لها كل شيء وبجبروتك التي غلبت بها كل شيء وبعزتك التي لا يقوم لها شيء وبعظمتك التي ملأت كل شيء وبسلطانك الذي على كل شيء وبوجهك الباقي بعد فناء كل شيء وبأسمائك التي ملأت أركان كل شيء وبعلمك الذي أحاط بكل شيء وبنور وجهك الذي أضاء له كل شيء. يا نور يا قدوس يا أول الأولين ويا آخر الآخرين. اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تهتك العصم. اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تنزل النقم. اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تغير النعم. اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تحبس الدعاء. اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تنزل البلاء. اللهم اغفر لي كل ذنب ذنبته وكل خطيئة أخطأتها. اللهم إني أتقرب إليك بذكرك وأستشفع بك إلى نفسك وأسألك بجودك أن تدنيني من قربك وأن توزعني شكرك وأن تلهمني ذكرك. اللهم إني أسألك سؤال خاضع متذلل خاشع أن تسامحني وترحمني وتجعلني بقسمك راضيا قانعا وفي جميع الأحوال متواضعا. اللهم وأسألك سؤال من اشتدت فاقته وأنزل بك عند الشدائد حاجة وعظم فيما عندك رغبته. اللهم عظم سلطانك وعلى مكانك وخفي مكرك وظهر أمرك وغلب قهرك وجرت قدرتك ولا يمكن الفرار من حكومتك. اللهم لا أجد لذنوبي غافرة ولا لكبائه ساترة ولا لشيء من عملي القبيح بالحسن مبدلا غيرك. لا إله إلا أنت سبحانك وبحمدك. ظلمت نفسي وتجرأت بجهلي وسكنت إلى قديم ذكرك لي ومنك علي. اللهم مولاي كم من قبيح سترته وكم من فاده من البلاء أقلته وكم من عثار وقيته وكم من مكروه دفعته وكم من ثناء جميل لست أهلا له نشرته. اللهم عظم بلائي وأفرط بي سوء حالي وقصرت بي أعمالي وقعدت بي أغلالي وحبسني عن نفعي بعد عملي وخدعتني الدنيا بغرورها ونفسي بجنايتها ومطالي. يا سيدي فأسألك بعزتك أن لا يحجب عنك دعائي سوء عملي وفعالي ولا تفزحني بخفي ما اطلعت عليه من سره ولا تعاجلني بالعقوبة على ما عملته في خلواتي من سوء فعلي وإساءتي ودوام تفريطي وجهالتي وكثرة شهواتي وغفلتي. وكن اللهم بعزتك لي في كل الأحوال رؤوفا وعلي في جميع الأمور عطوفا. إلهي وربي من لي غيرك أسأله كشف ضري والنظر في أمره. إلهي ومولاي أجريت علي حكما اتبعت فيه هوى نفسه ولم أحترس فيه من تزيين عدوه فغرني بما أهوى وأسعده على ذلك القضاء فتجاوزت بما جرى علي من ذلك بعض حدودك وخالفت بعض أوامرك فلك الحمد علي في جميع ذلك ولا حجة لي فيما جرى علي فيه قضاءك وألزمني حكمك وبلاؤك وقد أتيتك يا إلهي بعد تقصيري وإسرافي على نفسي معتذرا نادمة منكسرا مستقيلة مستغفرا منيبة مقرا مذعنا معترفة لا أجد مفرا مما كان مني ولا مفزعا أتوجه إليه في أمري غير قبولك عذري وإدخالك إياي في ساعتي من رحمتك اللهم فاقبل وذري وارحم شدة ذري وفكني من شد وثاقه يا رب ارحم ضعف بدني ورقة جلدي ودقة عظمي يا من بدا خلقي وذكري وتربيتي وبري وتغذيتي هبني لابتداء كرمك وصالف برك بي يا إلهي وسيدي وربي أتراك معذب بنارك بعد توحيدك وبعد من طوى عليه قلبي من معرفتك ولهج به لساني من ذكرك واعتقده ضميري من حبك وبعد صدق اعترافي ودعائي خاضئا لربوبيتك هيهات أنت أكرم من أن تضيع من ربيته أو تبعد من أدنيت أو تشرد من آويته أو تسلم إلى البلاء من كفيته ورحمته وليت شعري يا سيدي وإلهي ومولاي أتسلط النار على وجوه خرت لعظمتك ساجدة وعلى ألسن نطقت بتوحيدك صادقة وبشكرك مادحة وعلى قلوب اعترفت بإلهيتك محققة وعلى ضمائر حوت من العلم بك حتى صارت خاشعة وعلى جوارها سعت الأوطان تعبدك طاعية وأشارت باستغفارك مذعنة ما هكذا الظن بك ولا أخبرنا بفضلك عنك يا كريم يا ربي وأنت تعلم ضعفي عن قليل من بلاء الدنيا وعقوباتها وما يجري فيها من المكاره على أهلها على أن ذلك بلاء ومكروه قليل مكثوه يسير بقاه قصير مدته فكيف احتمال لبلاء الآخرة وجليل وقوع المكاره فيها وهو بلاء تطول مدته ويدوم مقامه ولا يخفف عن أهله لأنه لا يكون إلا عن غضبك وانتقامك وسخطك وهذا ما لا تقوم له السماوات والأرض يا سيدي فكيف لي وأنا عبدك الضعيف الذليل الحقير المسكين المستكين يا إلهي وربي وسيدي ومولاي لأي الأمور إليك أشكو ولما منها ضج وأبكي لعليم العذاب وشدته حمل طول البلاء ومدته فلئن صيرتني للعقوبات مع أعدائك وجمعت بيني وبين أهل بلائك وفرقت بيني وبين أحبائك وأوليائك فهبني يا إلهي وسيدي ومولاي وربي صبرت على عذابك فكيف أصبر على فراقك وهبني صبرت على حر نارك فكيف أصبر عن النظر إلى كرامتك أم كيف أسكن في النار ورجاء عفوك فبعزتك يا سيدي ومولاي أقسم صادقا لئن تركتني ناطقة لأضجن إليك بين أهلها ضجيج العاملين ولا أصرخن إليك صراخ المستصرخين ولا أبكين عليك بكاء الفاقدين ولو نادينك إن كنت يا ولي المؤمنين يا غاية آمال العارفين، يا غياث المستغيثين، يا حبيب قلوب الصادقين، ويا إله العالمين. أفتراك سبحانك يا إلهي وبحمدك تسمع فيها صوت عبد مسلم سجن فيها بمخالفته، وضاق طعم عذابها بمعصيته، وحبس بين أتباكها بجرمه وجريرته، وهو يضج إليك ضجيجا مؤمل لرحمتك، ويناديك بلسان أهل توحيدك، ويتوسل إليك بربوبيتك. يا مولاي، فكيف يبقى في العذاب وهو يرجو ما سلف من حلمك؟ أم كيف تؤلمه النار وهو يعمل فضلك ورحمتك؟ أم كيف يهرقه لهيبها وأنت تسمع صوته وترى مكانه؟ أم كيف يشتمل عليه زفيرها وأنت تعلم ضعفه؟ أم كيف يتقلقل بين أطباقها وأنت تعلم صدقه؟ أم كيف تزجره زبانيتها وهو يناديك يا ربه؟ أم كيف يرجو فضلك في عتقه منها فتتركه فيها؟ هيهات، ما ذلك الظن بك ولا المعروف من فضلك، ولا مشبه لما عملت به الموحدين من برك وإحسانك، فباليقين عكتوا لولا ما حكمت به من تعظيم جاهدك وقضيت به من إخلاد معاندك، لجعلت النار كلها بردا وسلاما، وما كانت لأحد فيها مقرا ولا مقامة. لكنك تقدست أسماؤك، أقسمت أن تملأها من الكافرين من الجنة والناس أجمعين، وأن تخلد فيها المعاندين، وأن تجل ثناؤك. قلت مبتدئا وتطولت بالإنعام متكرمة: أفمن كان مؤمنا كمن كان فاسقا لا يستوون. إلهي وسيدي، فأسألك بالقدرة التي قدرتها وبالقضية التي حتمتها وحكمته وغلبت من عليه أجريتها، أن تهب لي في هذه الليلة وفي هذه الساعة كل جرم أجرمته، وكل ذنب أذنبته، وكل قبيح أسررت، وكل جهل عملته كتمته أو أعلنته، أخفيته أو أظهرته، وكل سيئة أمرت بإثباتها الكرام الكاتبين الذين وكلتهم بحفظ ما يكون مني، وجعلتهم شهودا علي مع جوارح، وكنت أنت الرقيب علي من ورائهم والشاهد لما خفي عنهم، وبرحمتك أخفيته وبفضلك سترته، وأن توفر حظي من كل خير أنزلته، أو إحسان فضلته، أو بر نشرته، أو رزق بسطته، أو ذنب تغفر، أو خطأ تستره. يا ربي يا ربي يا رب، يا إلهي وسيدي ومولاي ومالك رقي، يا من بيده ناصيتي، يا عليما بضري ومسكنتي، يا خبيرا بفقري وفاقتي. يا ربي يا ربي يا رب، أسألك بحقك وقدسك وعظم صفاتك وأسمائك أن تجعل أوقات من الليل والنهار بذكرك معمورة، وبخدمتك موصولة، وأعمالي عندك مقبولة، حتى تكون أعمالي وأورادي كلها وردا واحدة، وحالي في خدمتك سرمدة. يا سيدي، يا من عليه مؤولي، يا من إليه شكوت أحوالي. يا ربي يا ربي يا رب، قوي على خدمتك جواره، واشدد على العزيمة جوانه، وهب لي الجد في خشيتك والدوام في الاتصال بخدمتك، حتى أسرح إليك في ميادين السابقين، وأسرع إليك في البارزين، وأشتاق إلى قربك في المشتاقين، وأدنو منك دنو المخلصين، وأخافك مخافة الموقنين، واجتمع في جوارك مع المؤمنين. اللهم ومن أرادني بالسوء فارد، ومن كادني فكد، واجعلني من أحسن عبيدك نصيبا عندك، وأقربهم منزلة منك، وأخصهم زلفة لديك، فإنه لا ينال ذلك إلا بفضلك. وجد لي بجودك، وعاطف علي بمجدك، واحفظني برحمتك، واجعل لساني بذكرك لهجة، وقلبي بحبك متيمة، ومن علي بحسن إجابتك، واقلني أثرتي، واغفر زلتي، فإنك قضيت على عبادك بعبادتك، وأمرتهم بدعائك، وضمنت لهم الإجابة. فإليك يا ربي نصبت وجهي، وإليك يا ربي مددت يدي، فبعزتك استجب لي دعائي، وبلغني مناي، ولا تقطع من فضلك رجائي، واكفني شر الجن والإنس من أعدائي. يا سريع الرضا اغفر لمن لا يملك إلا الدعاء، فإنك فعال لما تشاء. يا من اسمه دواء، وذكره شفاء، وطاعته غنى، ارحم من رأس ماله الرجاء، وسلاحه البكاء. يا سابغ النعم، يا دافع النقم، يا نور المستوحشين في الظلم، يا عالما لا يعلم، صل على محمد وآل محمد، وافعل به ما أنت أهله. وصلى الله على رسوله والأئمة الميامين من آله، وسلم تسليما كثيرا. سورة المباركة الفاتحة.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين، سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا وشفيع لذنوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا أبي القاسم محمد، والصلاة والسلام على أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين، ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين إلى قيام يوم الدين. وفقنا الله وإياكم بعلم وعمل صالح إن شاء الله، ببركة الصلاة على محمد وآل محمد. أما بعد، فقد قال الله الحكيم في كتابه الكريم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. واضرب لهم مثلا أصحاب القرية إذ جاءها المرسلون إذ أرسلنا إليهم 2 فكذبوهما فعززنا بثالث فقالوا إنا إليكم مرسلون. آمنا بالله. صدق الله العلي العظيم. Respected elders, scholars, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. What's fascinating about the Holy Quran is that in order to present a specific message, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what He does is He provides examples or parables or similes. And the whole purpose of this is to try and facilitate spiritual growth, to try and nurture spiritual growth to the people listening or the people reading the Holy Quran. And these are known as Darbul Mathal or Al-Amthal. And you have various scholars of tafsir who have taken these verses and have given, or they've authored certain books surrounding these verses that speak about parables and similes and all examples that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala delivers. Now the idea behind this is that when the Prophet is engaging with the Quraysh of Mecca, it gets to a certain area where it behooves him to start demonstrating or presenting certain examples to solidify or reinforce the message that he's talking about or he's introducing to the people. In this specific verse of Surah Al-Yasin, Allah commands the Holy Prophet, وَضْرِبْ لَهُمْ مَثَلًا, present the example of Ashab al-Qarya, of the inhabitants of the city. By doing so, it will have an athar, it will have an effect on the people listening. إِذْ جَاءَهَا الْمُرْسَلُونَ, the inhabitants of the city when we sent messengers towards them. Now, it's a very interesting narration that speaks about the events of this particular incident, but when we get to the examination of this hadith or this riwayah, I'll explain some of the critical examination that's there amongst the scholars of our time. But before going into the examination of the hadith, there are two major points that need to be mentioned. Number one, when Allah presents these dharb al-mathal, these examples or parables, the purpose of which is to nurture spiritual growth. Now, very interestingly, when you look at the whole dimension of the Holy Quran, when you look at how the Quran approaches the readers or those listening, the aim is to facilitate spiritual growth. And it does so in a number of different ways. At times, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what He does is He presents certain verses which are intellectual in nature. So He presents intellectual arguments. And you find a lot of these verses, some intellectual arguments presented within the Holy Quran are simple to understand, but some not so simple to understand. Now the problem with this is that the people that are listening, which are the Quraysh of Mecca, there was a level of deficiency in their aql, and therefore they were not able to understand the intellectual presentation of the Holy Quran, the arguments that were being presented to them. Now this happens to a lot of us. Our intellect is different, isn't it? We understand, we operate, or we understand certain realities at different levels. And if there's something that we don't understand, we refer to a teacher. And we all need teachers in our lives. The Quran likewise, when it presents an intellectual argument to the people, sometimes you'll come across certain individuals who are not able to appreciate or understand the argument that is being presented. So the Prophet has to come and he has to dissect the verse and say or explain to the people what argument Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is presenting. Why? Because their intellect is deficient. At times the imams would do the same thing. Today, in this day and age, the scholars would do the same thing. There are certain verses, we recite them on a daily basis, but when we actually go into the tafsir of the verse, we understand, or we try to understand, the argument that is presented by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Once we understand the argument and then we refer back to the verse, we appreciate the verse in a much more better light. So at times the people are deficient in their aql. Sometimes you find that it may go the other direction as well. Sometimes what happens is in our circles, we hear someone make an intelligent argument and we believe them because we testify that these people are intelligent. But we don't understand the argument that is often presented. Sometimes many of these arguments are fallacious in nature, they're false in nature. And it takes a scholar to actually take the argument, break it up, and say, look, the person that has presented this argument has gone wrong here. And that has affected his conclusion. Because the argument or the basis of the argument is fallacious, therefore the conclusion is fallacious as well. But for us, the level that we are, we're not able to identify this. And so we think that this argument is an intelligent argument and therefore has to be true. And this is a problem that has existed even in the time of the Greeks. In the time of the Greeks, the historical records tell us about the sophists. And the sophists were the type of people that were very good in their argumentation. They were debaters, they were orators. So they would come in public and they would debate with the people, and all they cared about was winning debates. They didn't care about the truth. They all cared about winning debates. And they would make all sorts of different arguments, and it would deceive the people, and the people would believe that they are intelligent. So you had people like, for example, Plato, Socrates, Aristotle. They would sit with their students and they would say, beware of the sophists. Do not mingle with them. Do not sit with them. Do not even listen to them. Because you think that they are making intelligent arguments, whereas the reality is that they are not intelligent. Their arguments are very much fallacious. It's false in nature. You don't understand it, but we do. So in the coming weeks, when we examine or break up the examination of this verse, you'll understand the arguments, the somewhat intelligent arguments that the Quraysh of Mecca as well as the Ashab al-Qarya would present to the prophets. And some of these arguments are very deep in nature. And how the prophets or the messengers responded to them. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Now when the Quran presents an intellectual argument, the Quraysh of Mecca, not all of them, the elite of Mecca were not able to understand or appreciate the argument that was being presented. The second strategy that the Quran uses is the content that it proposes to the people. So at times the Quran speaks about Tawheed, the Quran speaks about Nabuwah, the Quran speaks about Yawm al-Qiyamah. But for a person to appreciate these verses, he has to first believe. When you have a disbeliever who recites the Quran or reads the Quran and he reads the Risala of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alih, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad, it's not going to benefit him. Why? Because that iman is not there in his heart. He'll read the verses passively and then he'll move on to wherever he needs to go. Likewise Tawheed, likewise the Day of Judgment. Iman first has to be embedded within the heart for a person to be able to be influenced by such verses. The Quraysh of Mecca, likewise, when the Quran begins to speak about Tawheed and Nabuwah and the Day of Judgment, it doesn't affect them as much. They're not able to appreciate it. Why? Because Iman is not there. So when you have a person who is unaffected by the intellectual arguments of the Holy Quran, as well as the content of the Holy Quran, how does Allah use, or what strategy does Allah use to try and guide them and provide hidayah for them? He does so by using al-amthal. He uses examples. And these examples from a pedagogical perspective, it's phenomenal, it's remarkable. Allah takes a concept and He begins to speak about the reality of that specific concept to try and allow the person listening or reading the Holy Quran understand the magnitude of what is being spoken of. So when you look at the example of sadaqah, for example, sadaqah, very important act within our religion. Allah says in the Holy Quran that when a person gives in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it is like a grain of seed, it is like a grain. When you plant a seed onto the ground, then there are 7 offshoots that you will see from this single grain. And each of these offshoots will have 100 different grains. In the sense that a person, when he gives, however much he gives, in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the returns that he will get is 700 according to this particular parable, this particular method. So again, Allah takes a concept, He takes a very simple way of explaining it to explain to us the magnitude behind the act of giving sadaqah. When you look at, for example, hypocrisy, Allah gives examples of the hypocrites. When you look at kufr, disbelief, a kafir, and the position of the kafir, Allah, when He speaks about the kafir, He says the kafir is such a person that he comes and he shouts. Who is he shouting to? He's shouting to animals. Goats and cattle and sheep and so on and so forth. When a person shouts towards the cattle or certain animals, what do they expect to hear in return? The noises that the animal makes. Allah says the example of the kafir is a person who shouts towards the cattle and he hears the noises that the cattle make in return. They are dumb, they are deaf, they are blind, and they just don't have the capacity to understand. See, a very profound concept of kufr being explained in a very innovative perspective. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala throughout the Holy Quran gives a number of different examples highlighting different realities. At times, Allah, what He does is when He delivers an example, He speaks of previous nations. When He speaks of previous nations, again, it's a reality, a very strong, profound reality which has been explained through the innovative styles of storytelling. Here, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, when he's engaging in a dialogue with the Quraysh of Mecca, it reaches a stage where Allah then says to him, وَضْرِبْ لَهُمْ مَثَلًا, tell them about the people of, or the ashab of Qarya, the inhabitants of the city, so that they may understand what happened in history, so that they may realize how to change their lives today. The whole purpose of giving Mathal or amthal is to develop spiritual growth, is to facilitate spiritual growth. But that comes with a condition. The condition is that the person engages in pondering, thinking, reflecting of what is being said, and how it can be applied in this day and age. تِلْكَ الْأَمْثَالُ نَضْرِبُهَا لِلنَّاسِ لَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ. We've given them all of these examples so that they may ponder and think and see how it can be very much implemented within their lives. This is the first point. The second point. When the Prophet engages in a dialogue with the Quraysh of Mecca, it reaches a stage where Allah tells him, now give them the example of the inhabitants of the city. This tells us that the situation that the Prophet was going through was very much similar to the situation that is being mentioned in Surah Al-Yasin. There is great similarities between the two for Allah through His wisdom to tell the Prophet, now give them the example of the inhabitants of the city. When you look at the narration of how the inhabitants of the city, Ashab al-Qarya, they used to live their lives, it was much more profound than how the people of Jahiliyyah used to live their lives. Jahiliyyah, they were ignorant. They didn't have, for example, law, they didn't have politics, they didn't have education, they didn't have anything. Laws were created based on the whims of the elites of society. It was very much different compared to how the Ashab al-Qarya used to live their lives. It was much more well built. They had a political system. The king that was ruling in this particular village was very much wise, he was learned, and so on and so forth. But the situation that the Prophet was in was very much similar to the situation that the Mursalun were when they confronted the king of that time. Secondly, when we engage in a conversation, whatever the conversation may be, if there is a point that I need to make, I will solidify or reinforce my point using an example. But that example has to be acceptable by your standards. It has to be accepted by you. Otherwise, that example carries no weight and it doesn't reinforce the point that I'm making. It doesn't help my point in any way whatsoever. So if I make an example, or if I give an example, you have the veracity to go and check to see if it's true or not. If it's untrue, then you would dissolve my point altogether. If it's true, then you would actually think about it. Oh, this person has a point, and so on and so forth. But the point is, in the conversation, when I make an example, that example has to be acceptable by you. The Prophet, when commanded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to deliver an example of the people of the Ashab al-Qarya, that example has to be accepted according to the standards of the Quraysh. That's why the scholars, they come with this point and they say that they knew of what happened in the time of the Ashab al-Qarya. The Quraysh of Mecca, they had some level of awareness of what had happened in history at the time of Nabi Isa alayhi salam, as we'll examine, of what happened in that time for the Prophet to make his point and for him to actually have a point in what he's saying. If the Quraysh of Mecca had no awareness whatsoever and the Prophet was just giving an example out of thin air, it would carry no weight whatsoever. It would harm his message. In fact, if you were to directly link to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you would say that there is no wisdom in giving this point. And of course, this would be associated with Allah. Why would Allah do something which is in contrast to His wisdom? So, when the Prophet delivers this example, the people, the Quraysh of Mecca, very much knew of what happened. Maybe not in its finer details, but they knew or they were aware of this particular story. Number 3, you'll see this in the Quran, where the Holy Prophet of Islam often refers back to history. In making or solidifying his point or to strengthen his message, his risala, he would often go back to history to reinforce the point that he's making. And this is profound. There is a need of history and studying history. On the contrary, you find people have different beliefs saying, well, history is history. What's the point of going back and studying what has happened? Let's focus on the now. The now can be affected or can be very much influenced of what happened in history. You see, very interestingly, some scholars mention this. They say that each and every single one of us has developed a level of arrogance in our hearts. It's not the level of arrogance which is manifest, but it's there within our hearts. What's that type of arrogance? We believe that the day and age that we're living in now is far greater than all of the previous generations. As in, if I give you a simple example, if you compare 2020 to 1930s, for example, you say, oh, 2020 is far more better than the 1930s. Why? because our level of technology is greater, we have all of these different forms of entertainment and so on and so forth. Therefore, based on those standards, the day and age that we're living in now is far greater than the previous generations. The Quran goes against this idea. The Quran speaks about civilizations that were far greater. Far greater people have come before as well, and they did great things. If we are wise enough, we would take some of their values, implement them within our lives, within our societies, within our civilizations, and then you would see the nurturing of spiritual growth and facilitation of spiritual growth. There is a need to go back to history, and this is exactly what the Prophet does. The Prophet always highlights the stories of the previous prophets, the Anbiya and the Rusul that have come before, because there is great value to learn from them. At times when the Prophet's message would become very, very difficult, Haris, the Quran says, he was Haris. When they would not listen to him, he would feel hurt and he would care about his people. But then he would always reflect on the stories of Nabi Nuh and how he propagated his qawm, Nabi Ibrahim, Nabi Lut, and so on and so forth. And that would strengthen his heart. As the ayah mentions, it would strengthen the heart of the Holy Prophet. The Prophet would always refer back to history, use that as a platform to nurture spiritual growth, to revive the dead hearts. وَضْرِبْ لَهُمْ مَثَلًا. The verse before this is, إِنَّا نَحْنُ نُحْيِي الْمَوْتَى وَنَكْتُبُ مَا قَدَّمُوا وَآثَارَهُم. Yes, the verse is talking about the hereafter, where Allah says we will revive all of the dead. But in the process of doing so, by giving this example at this state in time, the Holy Prophet is now facilitating the revival of the dead hearts of the people listening. Now, when it comes to the examination of this particular narration, there is a narration that is associated with the event surrounding the Ashab al-Qarya and the messengers that were sent towards this city. As a disclaimer, there is a problem with this narration. And I'll explain very briefly, the critical opinions that are surrounding the veracity or the authentication of this narration. But we'll get to that in time. In Tafsir Majma' al-Bayan, Shaykh al-Tabrisi mentions this particular narration. He says, in the time of Nabi Isa alayhi salam, he came to know of a city in Antioch. Antioch, modern day Turkey. In the narrations, the name is Antakya. He realizes, or he comes to know, that the people of the city were idol worshippers. So by the command of Allah, he sends 2 of his disciples to go towards the city as messengers and to guide the people. When these 2 disciples, they leave and then they came towards the city of Antioch, when they entered the city, they saw the king, they saw the workers of the king, they saw the people, and they began very openly inviting the people towards Tawheed. Now there was a heavy backlash. When the king found out that these 2 people are disrupting the peace in society and inviting the people to a new religion, he does what every other king would do. He takes them and he imprisons them. He doesn't just imprison them, he punishes them. He lashes them with 100 lashes. And he keeps them imprisoned. Now the news comes back to Nabi Isa alayhi salam. Says, you sent 2 messengers, but they've been captured by the king and they've been imprisoned. Nabi Isa alayhi salam, what he does is he approaches his greatest disciple. The narration mentions his name, Shamu'un as-Safa. The biblical name, Simon Peter. Simon Peter, we've all heard of him, the greatest disciple of Nabi Isa alayhi salam. So he approaches Simon and he tells Simon, he says, go towards the city of Antioch. 2 of our brothers have been captured, they've been punished. Go and find out what their state is. So Simon, he leaves and he goes towards the city of Antioch. When he enters the city, he sees the king. He sees how the king behaves. He sees the people that are working for the king. And he says, look, my 2 brothers that came before, they used the strategy which was obviously that it didn't work for them. I can't use the same strategy, so I have to change things up a bit. So he goes, he hides his faith. He adopts taqiyya for a while. And it takes him a long while to achieve this particular objective. So in the state of taqiyya, he begins to interact with the king's workers. He speaks with them. He has all sorts of interactions with them, but he carries himself in a very moral way. His akhlaq is on point. The way he speaks, the way he walks, it's very much attractive. So the king's workers, they slowly developed a liking towards him. Now this, obviously, you can imagine, took a very long time. To the extent that one day the king's workers, when they approached the king, they said to the king, or they mentioned Simon to the king. So the king was now very much intrigued to meet Simon. So what he does is he invites Simon one day. Simon approaches the king, he approaches his court, he enters the presence of the king, he engages in a discussion with the king, a dialogue, and the king develops a liking towards him. Over a period of time, he is now within the king's inner circle. Simon is wise, he's intellectual, he has the best of ethics and morality. People are naturally attracted to this. One day, as Simon is discussing with the king, or is talking with the king, speaking with the king, he says, before I came into the city, there were two who came before me. And I heard that they came with a new religion. What happened to them? So the king says, Simon, I took them and I imprisoned them. He says, naturally, that's what someone would do in a defensive way. It makes sense. But did you, my king, give time to listen to what they were saying? King says, no, my anger refused me to listen to them. So Simon says to the king, he says, look, we are wise men. We want to search for the truth. Why don't we listen to them? Let's see if they are truthful in their words. If they are, then we will follow them, because that's what we do. We align ourselves with the truth. But if we are true, then they would have to align with our beliefs. The king likes the proposal, so he summons these two disciples. When they come towards Simon Peter, they're shocked to see the disciple of Nabi Isa alayhi salam, the greatest from amongst them, standing there alongside the king. But obviously they have to hide their emotions. So Simon Peter approaches the two disciples and he says to them, who has sent you to the city? So they respond, they say, Nabi Allah Isa alayhi salam has sent us to guide the people, to bring the people towards the path of Tawheed, that there is no God except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Simon responds, he says, do you have evidences to show that you are truthful to what you've just said now? Do you have an evidence to back yourself up? If I was to bring a blind man towards you, do you have the power to cure his blindness? So the disciples respond, they say, look, this is within the power and the capacity of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If Allah wills that we cure the blind, then so be it. Bi'idhnillah, tabaraka wa ta'ala. So Simon Peter tells the king, he says, bring two blind men. Two blind men are brought. Send one of them towards the two disciples. The blind man is taken towards the two disciples. The two disciples engage in a dua. And through the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the blind man is now able to see. But Simon Peter, what he does is, he approaches the second blind man. He recites his dua, and the second blind man is now able to see again. So he plays devil's advocate. He turns to the king. The king is absolutely shocked because the king has just witnessed two miracles performed by two different people. One by the disciples and one by Simon. This is something unnatural. It's supernatural. And it threw him off a bit. He says to the king, he says, look, we challenged them in a miracle, but I matched their miracle. So it cancels each other out. He says, my king, bring two men who are disabled, unable to walk, who are paralyzed. Let's challenge them to see if they can cure this man who is paralyzed so that he is able to walk again. So they bring two disabled men. They send one disabled man to the disciples engage in a dua, and he is able to walk. Bi'idhnillah. Simon Peter turns to the second disabled man, he recites his dua, and the second disabled man is able to walk again. So he turns to the king and he says, look, my king, we've challenged them with the second challenge, and I've matched their challenge. Again, it cancels each other out. But there is a third challenge, and only one of us can perform this third challenge. If they are able to perform or meet the criteria of this third challenge, if they're able to execute it, then I would know for a fact that they are truthful in their message, and I would believe them. But if I am able to perform, then they are obliged to follow me. The king asks him, he says, what is it? He says, my king, I've heard that your son has recently died. We will revive him. But if the disciples are able to revive him, then know that they are truthful in their words. He turns to the disciples, he says, are you able to revive the dead son of the king? They respond, bi'idhnillah. The narration says they both fell into prostration in sujood, and they engaged in dua. After a while, they stood up, they turned to the king, and they said, "O king, wherever your son is buried, go towards that location, you'll see your son standing alongside his grave." So the king, you can imagine, in a very emotional state, very, very emotional state. He leaves, he hastens, he rushes towards the grave of his son. When they approach the grave of his son, he sees his son standing outside of his grave, covered in dirt and mud and sand. Now, very emotional. The king approaches his son, embraces him, kisses him. He tells his son that he's missed him a lot. He says, "You've been dead for a while. How was your experience being dead? What did you go through?" The son responds, he says, "My father, something very interesting happened." He says, "I can't remember much, but what I remember is I saw two people in the state of sujood, begging Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for me to come back to this world." So the king turns to his son, he says that if given the opportunity, would you be able to recognize who these two people are? He says, "Yes, absolutely." So the king commands all of the people in the city, all the men, to come out into the outskirts of the city. He tells his son, he says, "Go into the crowd and identify who these two men were." The son enters the crowd, he identifies one of the disciples, he says, "This is the man who was there in the state of prostration." And then alongside him was the second disciple, he says, "These two are the ones who begged Allah for me to come back into the world." Simon Peter turns to the king, he says, "Look, this son of yours has just been brought back from the dead. Because of these two disciples, I believe in their message. My king, what about you?" The king responds, "Wa'ana ma'ak," and I am with you, and I will believe in their message as well. Now come back. The narration itself is problematic. Why? Because when you look at the ayat of the Quran that come after, the ayats mention that the people belied these messengers, and they persecuted the messengers, and they even killed them. Whereas the narration tells us that the king believed and the people believed as well. Ayatollah Makarim Shirazi, in the discussion of this verse, he comes from a different perspective. He says, look, when we look at the different tafsir that we have, Tafsir al-Qummi mentions this hadith, Shaykh al-Tabrasi in his Majmu' al-Bayan, Tafsir al-Burhan, all of these great mufassirin have mentioned this ayah, this story in regards to these ayah. We can't come and say that this is a fabrication or this is weak. It says, but according to my scholarly understanding, I have come to the conclusion that the narrator who took this story from Imam Baqir alayhi salam has falsely, or wrongly, mistakenly ascribed it to the Ashab al-Qaryah mentioned in Surah al-Yasin. Meaning what? Meaning that this was of a different city and not the city that is mentioned in Surah al-Yasin. But there was some confusion somewhere, and he has falsely associated with the city of Surah al-Yasin. Mistakes happen, not all of us are ma'soom. This was the mistake of the companion when he was listening from Imam Baqir alayhi salatu wasalam. Other companions, other mufassirin, they came from a different perspective. Amongst them, Tafsir Fakhruddin al-Razi in his Tafsir Mafatih al-Ghaib, he comes from a different perspective. He says, look, just because the king believed doesn't mean that the people believed as well. There's a difference. And even if the people did believe, they could always revert back to their old belief. As in history, the whole Quran is full of this. Nabi Ibrahim alayhi salam, how many miracles did he perform in front of Nimrod? Did Nimrod believe? How many miracles did Nabi Musa alayhi salam perform in front of Fir'aun? Did Fir'aun believe? How many miracles did Rasulullah perform in front of Quraysh? Did they believe? They fought him until the very end, until they were subjugated and overwhelmed. Until then they came towards only then they came towards the religion of Islam. But throughout the 23-year tenure of Rasulullah, they witnessed so many different miracles, yet they still disbelieved in his message. Just by witnessing miracles, it doesn't mean that a person will therefore believe in the message that is being proposed by the Prophet or the Messenger. Karbala is a beautiful example of this. That interaction with Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam is no less than a miracle. To be from Ahl al-Kisa, to interact with someone from Ahl al-Kisa, this is no less than a miracle. And you find that there were thousands who opposed him and were willing to kill him for a few gold coins here and there. Yet there were those who, when they heard the cries of Abi Abdullah alayhi salam, Hal min nasirin yansurna, is there no one there to help and aid us? From amongst them, the best from amongst them was Hur ibn Yazid al-Riyah. As soon as he hears the cries of Abu Abdullah alayhi salam, he begins to shake. In hesitancy, they ask him, Ya Hur, you are the best of fighters, and you shake before the battle begins. He says, Wallah, I see myself standing between Jannah wal Jahannam. He hastens towards Abi Abdullah alayhi salam. On the 10th of Muharram, he enters the battlefield and he is killed. Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, alongside his body, he says, Ya Hurra anta al-hurru fi dunya wal akhirah. You are indeed free in this world as well as in the hereafter. But what happened afterwards was a greater tragedy. When Umar ibn Sa'ad commanded all of the shuhada to be aligned, one by one they were gathered and placed in a line. Then he turned towards the 10 horse riders and he said to them, prepare yourselves to trample on the bodies of the shuhada. One by one, just as they were about to engage in the trampling of the bodies, the Bani Tamim, they came and they said to Umar ibn Sa'ad, you will not trample on this body. Yes, he betrayed us, but he deserves a burial and we will bury him the way he deserves to be buried. They collected his body and they removed him from the rest of the shuhada. Then each of the martyrs, each of the shuhada were taken by their respected tribes until the body of Abu Abdullah alayhi salam was left alone, abandoned in the sands of Karbala, and the hooves of the horses began trampling on his body. Ya Bani Tamim, you took away the body of Hur, but you left the body of his master to be trampled under the hooves of the horses. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. سيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون. إنا لله